Not a single guard must break formation. It would be a disgrace to the Pope himself. That was Commandant Schmid's final instruction before the funeral began. But as Pope Francis's coffin was carried into St. Peter's Square, one guard suddenly stepped out of line, revealing something no one could have imagined. The entire Vatican was left in shock. What was concealed beneath his uniform? Before we uncover the truth, make sure to hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let's dive into the story. The morning sun cast long shadows across St. Peter's Square, its golden rays catching the ancient stones that had witnessed centuries of papal ceremonies. The Vatican stirred to life as it had for over 1,000 years, with the quiet rustle of carsacks and the distant murmur of morning prayers. But this day was different. This day, the bells would toll not for celebration, but for farewell. Lance Corporal Lucas Bowman stood at his post outside the Apostolic Palace, his blue and gold uniform pristine, his halberd held at the precise angle demanded by 5 centuries of tradition. At 24, he was young for a Swiss guard, but his record was exemplary. 3 years of service without a single mark against his name. 3 years of perfect obedience to the ancient codes that governed every aspect of their existence. The other guards called him Stoneface, not out of mockery, but respect. Lucas never flinched, never showed emotion, never broke character even when tourists tried to provoke reactions with silly faces or inappropriate questions. He was what every Swiss guard aspired to be, the perfect embodiment of duty, honor, and unwavering loyalty to the Holy Father. But perfection, as Lucas would soon learn, sometimes comes at a price that the human heart cannot bear to pay. The news had reached them 3 days ago. Pope Francis, the people's pope, the man who had walked among the poor and embraced the forgotten, had passed away in his sleep. The announcement sent shockwaves through the Catholic world. But within the Vatican walls, it meant something else entirely. The beginning of the most sacred and scrutinized ceremony in their calendar, a papal funeral. Lucas had served during many important events, but nothing compared to this. World leaders would attend. Millions would watch on television. Every movement, every gesture, every breath would be observed and analyzed. The Swiss Guard would be on display as never before, the living embodiment of Vatican tradition and discipline. Commandant Colonel Heinrich Schmid called the briefing for dawn. The assembled guards stood in perfect formation in the ancient barracks beneath the Apostolic Palace, their faces grave in the flickering candlelight. Schmid was a man carved from granite, 43 years old, 25 years of service, and a reputation for absolute intolerance of any deviation from protocol. "Gentlemen," Schmid began, his voice echoing off the stone walls, "in 3 days, we will lay our Holy Father to rest. The eyes of the world will be upon us. Cardinals from every continent, heads of state, millions of faithful, all watching, to see if we are worthy of the trust placed in us 500 years ago." He paced before them like a general preparing for battle, his boots clicking against the ancient stones. "I will say this once, and only once. There will be no mistakes, no hesitation, no individual displays of emotion or personality. You are not mourners, you are guardians. You do not grieve, you serve. Any man who cannot separate his personal feelings from his duty has no place in this unit." Lucas felt the words settle over him like a lead blanket. He understood the necessity. The Swiss Guard's reputation was built on their absolute reliability, their stone-faced professionalism in the face of any circumstance. But something about Schmid's words troubled him, though he couldn't quite name what it was. "The funeral procession will begin at 10 o'clock sharp," Schmid continued. "Full ceremonial dress. We will form the honor guard as the casket is carried from the Sistine Chapel to St. Peter's Basilica. Once positioned, no guard will move, speak, or acknowledge anything beyond his immediate duty. Is this understood?" "Yes, sir," came the unified response, Lucas's voice joining the chorus automatically. But even as he spoke the words, something nagged at him. A memory, perhaps, or a feeling he couldn't quite grasp. It would be 2 more days before he understood what it was. After the briefing, the guards dispersed to their quarters to prepare. Equipment had to be inspected, uniforms pressed to perfection, ceremonial weapons polished until they gleamed. Lucas went through the familiar motions with practiced efficiency, but his mind wandered to the man they would be honoring. Pope Francis had been different from his predecessors, where others had maintained the dignified distance expected of their office. Francis had reached out, literally and figuratively, to touch the lives of ordinary people. Lucas had witnessed it firsthand during papal audiences, the way the Pope's eyes would light up when he saw a child, how he would break protocol to embrace someone in distress, his genuine laughter at simple jokes from visitors. The second day brought a flurry of preparation throughout the Vatican. Diplomatic delegations arrived hourly, their security details coordinating with Vatican officials and the Swiss Guard command. Lucas found himself assigned to escort duty, guiding visiting dignitaries through the labyrinthine corridors of the Apostolic Palace. It was during one of these assignments that he encountered Sister Maria Concetta, an elderly nun from Buenos Aires who had worked closely with Pope Francis. During his time as Archbishop, she was small and hunched with age, her weathered hands clutching a simple wooden rosary, but her eyes held a clarity that seemed to pierce through pretense. "You knew His Holiness well," Lucas observed as he guided her through the palace corridors. "Making conversation as protocol required, Jorge," she said, using the Pope's given name with a familiarity that would have shocked most Vatican officials. "Oh yes, I knew him before he was anyone important. Just a young priest who would sneak food to the street children when he thought no one was looking." She paused to catch her breath, leaning against one of the ancient marble columns. "He never forgot where he came from, you know. Even as Pope, he would write letters, real letters, in his own hand, to people he met. Not just important people, everyone. The janitor who cleaned his apartment, the security guard who worked the night shift, the children from the favelas who would wave at him from behind the barriers." Lucas felt something stir in his chest, a warmth he quickly suppressed. Personal connections were dangerous for a Swiss guard. They clouded judgment, created vulnerabilities. But Sister Maria's words painted a picture of a man who had somehow maintained his humanity despite the isolating grandeur of papal office. He understood something that many people in positions of power never learn. She continued, fixing Lucas with those penetrating eyes. "That true authority comes not from the office you hold, but from the love you show. Not from the protocols you follow, but from the moments when you choose to break them for something greater." Her words echoed in Lucas's mind long after he had delivered her to her destination. That evening, alone in his quarters, he found himself thinking not about ceremonial procedures or security protocols, but about the man they were preparing to honor. What would Pope Francis have thought about Schmid's rigid instructions? About the emphasis on emotionless perfection over genuine mourning? The answer came to him the next morning, delivered in a way that would change everything. The third day dawned grey and somber, as if the Roman sky itself was mourning. Lucas rose before dawn for morning prayers, a personal ritual he had maintained throughout his service, though it was not required. The chapel was empty at that hour, filled only with the soft glow of votive candles and the lingering scent of incense from the previous evening's vespers. He was returning to his quarters when he found it, a small envelope slipped under his door, bearing the papal seal. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it, thinking it might be some last-minute instruction or protocol change. Instead, he found something that shook him to his core, a personal letter, written in the Pope's own careful script. "My dear Lucas," it began, "I hope you will forgive an old man's presumption in writing to you directly. I have observed you during my time here, and I have been impressed not only by your dedication to duty, but by the kindness I have seen you show when you think no one is watching. The way you helped that elderly pilgrim who fell in the square, the patience you showed with the confused tourist who spoke no Italian, the gentle manner in which you guided that frightened child back to her parents." Lucas's throat tightened. He had no idea the Pope had noticed those small moments, incidents he had considered insignificant, natural responses that any decent person would have made. The letter continued, "I write to you now because I fear that in the formality of my funeral, something important might be lost. I have lived my life believing that our highest calling is not to follow rules perfectly, but to love perfectly. Sometimes, not often, but sometimes, these two things come into conflict. When they do, I hope you will remember that I was not Pope because I followed every protocol, but because I tried to follow my heart toward what was right and good and true." Lucas read the words twice, then 3 times, each reading deepening their impact. The Pope was asking him to consider something that went against everything he had been trained to believe, that there might be times when duty and conscience pointed in different directions, and that choosing conscience was not betrayal but the highest form of service. The letter concluded with words that would haunt him. Through the remaining hours, Do not let tradition become a cage that prevents you from doing what love demands. Even soldiers, perhaps especially soldiers, must sometimes let their hearts lead. With my blessing and my gratitude for your service, Francis. Lucas sat in his small room for a long time, the letter trembling in his hands. Outside, he could hear the preparations continuing, the arrival of more delegations, the testing of sound equipment, the final rehearsals of the ceremonial elements. The machinery of the funeral was grinding into motion, precise and inexorable as clockwork. But inside his heart, something else was happening, a quiet revolution that would soon reshape everything he thought he knew about duty, honor, and love. The morning of the funeral arrived with all the weight of history. Lucas woke before his alarm, his dreams filled with images of the Pope's funeral letter and Sister Maria's words about the importance of breaking protocol for something greater. He dressed with unusual care, each element of his uniform inspected and adjusted until it achieved absolute perfection. If he was going to do what he was beginning to think he might do, he wanted to honor the occasion with impeccable presentation. The other guards were quieter than usual as they prepared. Even among these disciplined men, the solemnity of the day was palpable. They would be burying not just a pope, but a man who had touched millions of lives, who had changed the very nature of papal leadership through his humility and accessibility. Sergeant Mueller, a grizzled veteran with 15 years of service, paused beside Lucas as they formed up for the final inspection. "You seem different today, Bowman," he observed quietly. "Everything all right?" Lucas met his gaze steadily. "Just thinking about what we're doing today, what it means. Best not to think too much," Mueller advised, though not unkindly. "Thinking gets you in trouble in this job. Just follow orders, do your duty, get through the day. That's how we honor him, by being what he needed us to be." But Lucas wondered if that was true. Had Pope Francis really needed them to be emotionless automatons, or had he needed them to be something else, something more human, more connected to the reality of loss and love that surrounded them? Commandant Schmid appeared for the final inspection, his eyes scanning each man with laser intensity. When he reached Lucas, he paused for a moment longer than usual, as if sensing something different. But Lucas's bearing was perfect, his uniform immaculate, his expression properly neutral. After a moment, Schmid nodded and moved on. "Gentlemen," Schmid announced when the inspection was complete, "today we write another chapter in 500 years of faithful service. Every eye will be upon us. Every camera will capture our performance. We are not just guards today, we are the living embodiment of Vatican tradition and papal dignity. Do not forget that responsibility." As they marched toward their positions, Lucas felt the letter pressing against his chest, tucked safely inside his uniform. He had memorized every word, but having the physical document close to his heart somehow made the Pope's message more real, more immediate. With each step, he found himself caring less about the cameras and the watching world, and more about honoring the man who had trusted him with such profound words. The crowds were already gathering in St. Peter's Square as the Swiss Guard took their positions. Thousands of mourners, many who had traveled from around the world, stood in respectful silence as the elaborate funeral preparations reached their final stages. Lucas could see tears on many faces, could feel the genuine grief that permeated the gathering. These people had not come to witness a ceremony. They had come to say goodbye to someone they loved. That realization crystallized something in Lucas's mind. This was not a military operation or a diplomatic event. It was a funeral, a time for mourning, for remembrance, for the kind of authentic human emotion that Schmid's protocols seemed designed to eliminate. The funeral mass began with all the ancient pageantry of papal ceremony, cardinals in their scarlet vestments, bishops from every continent, the haunting beauty of the Sistine Chapel choir singing the Requiem. Lucas stood at attention with his fellow guards, forming a corridor of blue and gold through which the most powerful figures in the Catholic Church would pass. But as the ceremony unfolded, Lucas found his attention drawn not to the dignitaries or the elaborate ritual, but to the ordinary people in the crowd. An elderly man weeping openly, his weathered hands clutched in prayer, a young mother holding her child up to see the proceedings, whispering explanations about the importance of the moment, a group of nuns from what looked like a poor order, their simple habits contrasting sharply with the ornate vestments of the hierarchy, their faces glowing with genuine love for the man they were remembering. These were Pope Francis's people, the poor, the marginalized, the forgotten ones he had championed throughout his papacy. They had not come to observe a state funeral. They had come to mourn a friend, a father figure, a voice that had spoken for them when no one else would listen. The moment that changed everything came during the reading of the Gospel. As the words of Christ's Sermon on the Mount echoed through the basilica, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are the meek," Lucas felt something break open inside his chest. These were not just ancient words being recited. They were the living principles that had guided the Pope's life and ministry. He thought of the letter again, of the Pope's urging to let love guide his actions, even when it conflicted with rigid protocol. He thought of Sister Maria's words about the importance of choosing humanity over procedure. And suddenly, with startling clarity, he knew what he had to do. The processional began as the casket was carried from the altar toward the entrance of the basilica. The Swiss Guard formed their honor corridor, each man standing perfectly still, as centuries of tradition demanded. But as the casket approached his position, Lucas felt his hand moving, almost of its own accord, toward the letter hidden inside. His uniform, for a moment, doubt crashed over him like a wave. His career would be over, his reputation destroyed. He would face the wrath of his superiors and the incomprehension of his fellow guards. Everything he had worked for, everything he had achieved, would be swept away in an instant of defiance. But then he looked at the casket, thought of the man inside who had lived his entire papacy as an act of holy rebellion against comfortable conventions, and he knew that some things mattered more than career and reputation. Some moments demanded not the perfect soldier, but the perfectly human response. With steady hands, Lucas withdrew the letter from his uniform. The paper felt almost weightless, but its significance made it seem to weigh more than his ceremonial halberd. Around him, he sensed, rather than saw, the sudden tension among his fellow guards. The sharp intake of breath from spectators who realized something unprecedented was happening. Time seemed to slow as Lucas stepped forward, breaking the rigid line that had stood unbroken for 5 centuries. Each step felt like a small earthquake, shattering protocols that had seemed as permanent as the stones of St. Peter's itself. But with each step, Lucas felt lighter, more free, more aligned with something deeper than duty, aligned with love. The moment Lucas placed the Pope's letter on the casket was like a stone thrown into still water. The ripples spread outward in ever-widening circles of shock and confusion. The other Swiss guards remained frozen at attention, their training warring with their instinct to react to this unprecedented breach of protocol. In the VIP section, Cardinal Rousseau's face flushed crimson with rage and embarrassment. "Heresy," Rousseau hissed to the cardinal beside him, his voice carrying further than he intended in the sudden silence. "This is an outrage. Remove him immediately." But Commandant Schmid, for all his rigidity, was too experienced to create a scene that would overshadow the funeral itself. A slight gesture kept the other guards in position, while his mind raced through the implications of what had just occurred. Discipline would come later. For now, the ceremony must continue. Lucas stepped back to his position, his face serene in a way that surprised even him. He had expected to feel terror, shame, regret. Instead, he felt a profound peace, as if he had finally aligned his actions with his deepest convictions. Around him, the funeral procession continued, but the atmosphere had subtly shifted. What had been a formal state ceremony now carried an undercurrent of authentic human emotion. In the crowd, reactions varied wildly. Some spectators were scandalized by the breach of protocol, their faces showing shock and disapproval. But others, particularly those who had known Pope Francis personally or had been touched by his ministry, understood immediately what they had witnessed. This was not disrespect. It was the highest form of respect possible, a young man choosing to honor his Pope's true nature, rather than the institutional expectations surrounding his memory. Sister Maria Concepta, watching from the section reserved for Vatican employees, pressed her weathered hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks. She had seen what the letter contained during Lucas's escort duties, had watched the young guard's internal struggle with growing understanding. Now, seeing his choice, she whispered a prayer of gratitude for the courage it must have taken. The ceremony continued with papal dignity, but something had changed in its emotional resonance. The letter, simple and white against the rich wood of the casket, seemed to transform the entire proceedings, from a formal farewell to something more personal, more human. Even Cardinal Rousseau, after his initial outrage, found himself moved by the gesture's obvious sincerity. as the casket was carried toward its final resting place. The letter remained where Lucas had placed it, a small but powerful symbol of the connection between the institutional church and the personal faith that drove it. The Pope, who had spent his papacy breaking protocol in service of love, was being honored by someone who had learned that lesson well. The burial itself passed in a haze for Lucas. He performed his duties mechanically, his mind focused not on the ceremonies but on what would come next. He knew there would be consequences, serious ones. The Swiss Guard did not tolerate insubordination, even well-intentioned insubordination. His service was effectively over. The only question was whether he would face formal disciplinary action or be quietly transferred away from his position. But, as he stood at attention during the final prayers, watching the Pope's casket being lowered into its tomb beneath St. Peter's Basilica, Lucas felt no regret. The letter had been delivered. The Pope's final message about the importance of choosing love over rigid protocol had been honored in the most public way possible. Whatever happened to him now seemed less important than the knowledge that he had acted with integrity in a moment that demanded nothing less. The hours following the funeral felt like a strange suspended animation. The dignitaries departed, the crowds dispersed, and the Vatican settled back into its ancient rhythms. But everyone who had witnessed Lucas's action knew that something significant had occurred, something that would be remembered and discussed long after the formal ceremonies were forgotten. Lucas was summoned to Commandant Schmid's office as the sun was setting over Rome. The walk through the Vatican corridors felt longer than usual, each step echoing off stones that had witnessed centuries of human drama. He passed familiar faces, fellow guards, Vatican staff, clergy, and saw, in their expressions, a mixture of curiosity, concern, and in some cases, what looked like admiration. Schmid's office was spartanly furnished, dominated by portraits of previous commandants and displays of ceremonial weapons. The commandant himself sat behind his desk, his face unreadable, while two other senior officers flanked him. The setting was designed to intimidate, and under normal circumstances, it would have succeeded. "Sit," Schmid commanded, his voice carrying none of its usual military courtesy. Lucas took the indicated chair, maintaining the perfect posture that had been drilled into him since his first day of service. He met Schmid's gaze steadily, without defiance but also without submission. "Explain yourself," Schmid said simply. Lucas had prepared for this moment during the long hours since the funeral. He could have offered excuses, could have claimed temporary emotional disturbance, or tried to minimize the significance of his actions. Instead, he chose honesty. "The Holy Father wrote me a personal letter," he began, his voice steady, despite the gravity of the situation. "In it, he asked me to remember that sometimes our highest duty is to follow our conscience, rather than protocol. Today, my conscience told me that honoring his memory required a personal gesture, not just military precision." Schmid's expression didn't change, but Lucas caught a flicker of something, surprise, perhaps, or grudging respect in the older man's eyes. "You understand what you've done?" Schmid asked. "You've broken 500 years of tradition. You've embarrassed this unit in front of the entire world. You've created a precedent that could undermine everything we stand for." "I understand the gravity of my actions," Lucas replied, "but I also understand that Pope Francis spent his entire papacy showing us that sometimes tradition must bend to accommodate love. I chose to honor that lesson." The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of institutional authority, confronting personal conviction. Finally, Schmid leaned back in his chair, his military bearing softening almost imperceptibly. "The letter," he said. "What did it say, exactly?" Lucas recited the Pope's words from memory, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. As he finished, he saw something unexpected in the faces of the three officers, not anger or disappointment, but thoughtful consideration. He wrote similar letters to others. One of the senior officers said quietly, "The night custodian." Several of the gardeners, "That young seminarian who works in the Vatican library." Always the same message that love must guide our actions, even when it conflicts with expectation. Schmid nodded slowly. "We've been receiving calls all evening. From Vatican officials, yes, but also from ordinary people who witnessed what you did. The responses are ... mixed. Some are outraged by the breach of protocol, but others ... He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Others are calling it the most beautiful moment of the entire funeral. They're saying it captured something essential about who Pope Francis was, someone who valued genuine human connection over institutional formality. The disciplinary hearing was scheduled for the following morning, but Lucas found sleep impossible. He spent the night walking the Vatican gardens, thinking about his future and what his actions meant for the Swiss Guard as an institution. In the pre-dawn darkness he encountered unexpected company. Several of his fellow guards, including Sergeant Mueller, who had sought him out. "Thought you might want some company," Mueller said gruffly, falling into step beside him. They walked in comfortable silence for a while before Mueller spoke again. "That letter, the one you placed on the casket, you read it to Schmid?" Lucas nodded. "Good," Mueller said. "Because there's something you should know. We've been talking, not all of us, but enough. What you did today, ... It wasn't just about you and the Pope. It was about all of us. About what it means to serve something greater than ourselves." Other guards emerged from the shadows as they walked, young recruits and grizzled veterans, men who had dedicated their lives to the same ideals that Lucas had grappled with. Their presence was both comforting and sobering. Whatever consequences he faced, he wouldn't face them entirely alone. "The thing is," said Corporal Zimmermann, a quiet man from Zurich who rarely spoke in groups, "we all knew Pope Francis was different. We all saw how he tried to break down the barriers between the papacy and the people. But none of us had the courage to respond to that example. You did." The conversation that followed, conducted in the hushed tones appropriate to the early morning hour, revealed something remarkable. Lucas's action had forced his fellow guards to confront their own understanding of duty and service. Some were troubled by the breach of protocol, but many found themselves questioning whether absolute adherence to rules was always the highest form of faithfulness. "My grandfather served in the Swiss Guard," said Lance Corporal Bowman, barely 18 and still awed by the traditions he was part of. "He used to tell me stories about the guards who served during World War II, how they had to make impossible choices between following orders and following their consciences. He said the best guards were the ones who understood that true loyalty sometimes requires disobedience." As dawn broke over Rome, painting the ancient buildings in shades of gold and rose, the group of guards found themselves at the spot where Lucas had made his fateful decision. The funeral preparations had been cleared away, but something of the previous day's solemnity still lingered in the air. "Whatever happens in the hearing," Mueller said finally, "you should know that what you did yesterday changed something for all of us. It reminded us that we're not just ceremonial figures or security personnel. We're human beings serving something sacred, and sometimes that means taking risks that pure military discipline wouldn't allow." The hearing itself, when it finally convened, was unlike anything in Swiss Guard history. The panel consisted not just of military officers, but also Vatican officials who had to consider the broader implications of Lucas's action. Cardinal Perelin, the Secretary of State, was present, as was the Master of Papal Liturgical Celebrations and the Prefect of the Papal Household. Lucas stood at attention as the charges were read: breach of protocol, failure to maintain position, unauthorized action during a ceremonial function. Each charge was technically accurate, but they seemed to capture nothing of the moral complexity of what had actually occurred. The testimony phase of the hearing revealed the true complexity of Lucas's situation. Cardinal Russo spoke passionately about the importance of maintaining Vatican dignity and the dangerous precedent set by allowing personal judgment to override institutional protocol. His arguments were logical and well-reasoned. If guards could break ranks whenever they felt emotionally moved, the entire foundation of Vatican security and ceremonial function would be undermined. But when Sister Maria Concetta was called to testify about her conversations with Lucas, the tone of the proceedings shifted dramatically. She spoke not as an institutional representative, but as someone who had known Pope Francis personally, who understood his heart and his intentions. "The Holy Father spent his papacy trying to show us that the Church exists to serve love, not the other way around," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the formal chamber. Young Lucas understood that message better than many who have studied theology for decades. His action was not a rejection of authority. It was the highest form of obedience to the authority that truly matters. The most surprising testimony came from Commandant Schmid himself. Rather than simply condemning Lucas's breach of discipline, he provided context that few in the room had expected. "In my 25 years of service," Schmid said, "I have seen many guards face moments that tested their understanding of duty. The best guards, the ones who truly embody what this position requires, are not those who follow orders blindly, but those who understand the deeper purpose behind the orders. Lance Corporal Bowman faced an impossible choice between institutional loyalty and personal conscience. The fact that he chose conscience in a moment dedicated to honoring a pope who consistently made the same choice suggests not a failure of duty but a profound understanding of what duty actually means. The deliberation lasted 3 hours. When the panel reconvened, Cardinal Parolin delivered a verdict that would reshape how the Vatican understood the relationship between tradition and human authenticity. The charges against Lance Corporal Bowman are technically valid, he began. He did breach protocol, he did break formation, he did act without authorization. Under normal circumstances, these actions would result in immediate dismissal from the Swiss Guard. Lucas felt his stomach tighten, but he maintained his composure. However, Parolin continued, these were not normal circumstances. We were not conducting a routine ceremony, but honoring a pope who spent his entire ministry showing us that love must sometimes supersede law, that mercy must sometimes trump justice, that the human heart must sometimes lead where institutional wisdom fears to follow. The cardinal paused, looking directly at Lucas. Your action was unprecedented. Yes, it was unauthorized, certainly, but it was also profoundly appropriate to the man we were honoring and the message he tried to leave us. Therefore, while we cannot ignore the breach of protocol, we choose to interpret it not as insubordination, but as a form of faithful service that transcends traditional categories. The verdict was complex. Lucas would be formally reprimanded for breach of protocol, but he would not be dismissed from service. Instead, he would be reassigned to a new position within the Vatican, one that would allow him to use his demonstrated capacity for moral judgment in service of the Church's broader mission. 6 months later, Lucas found himself serving as a liaison between the Vatican and charitable organizations working with refugees and the poor, populations that Pope Francis had championed throughout his papacy. It was not the military career he had originally envisioned, but it felt like a truer expression of the calling that had led him to Vatican service in the first place. The letter that had started it all was eventually placed in the Vatican secret archives, where it joined thousands of other documents that testified to the complex relationship between institutional authority and personal faith. But its message lived on in the quiet conversations among Vatican staff, in the slightly more human approach that Swiss guards began to take in their interactions with visitors, and in the growing understanding that even the most ancient traditions must sometimes bend to accommodate the demands of love. Lucas never regretted his choice. In years to come, when young guards asked him about that day, he would tell them that true service sometimes requires the courage to disappoint those who expect perfect compliance in order to honor something greater than expectation. Pope Francis, he believed, would have understood.